Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and it's week 9 here. EOU, History 448, History of Modern Russia. This week, we have a lighter week. We're just going to have our graded discussion forum. Remember, make your first post or reply by Thursday. Make sure you have one post, 2 replies over 2 separate days during the week. Just fulfill those basic requirements. Make sure your posts and replies are of a substantial nature. There's no reason for me to even say it because we've been doing, really as a class, we've been doing great with our discussion forums. So this week, just the discussion forum. We'll be back looking at service. We'll be reading chapter 20 and 21. And this week, we're primarily going to be examining the period of détente. So détente refers to a period of a lessening of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, which occurs in the 1970s. And it's ushered in largely by agreements, ushered through by first Richard Nixon and then Leonid Brezhnev, and then of course Gerald Ford and Leonid Brezhnev. And these were agreements like the Helsinki Accords under the Gerald Ford administration, the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement with Nixon and Brezhnev, and of course the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty Agreement. These were some of the real core steps towards creating détente. Of course, too, it's during the Nixon administration where we have the visits of Nixon and Kissinger to China in the beginning of the process of the opening of the door to China, which even though the Chinese and the Soviets had very much kind of split by the 1970s, this is sometimes referred to as the Sino-Soviet split, the kind of opening of the way to normalization of relations with the government in Beijing, the Chinese Communist government, was also considered to be a major step in developing the atmosphere of détente in the 1970s. Again, a sort of lessening of tensions in the Cold War. So we're reading Service, chapter 20 and 21. Our only graded assignment this week is the discussion forum. For that reason, I want everyone to make sure that you're working on your papers this week. I've had some folks, send, revised paper ideas, revised thesis statements back to me, and that's great. Your papers should be evolving as you do research and as you think about my comments and as you delve into your own research. It's a very normal thing for many of you to, have to adjust and change your topic, and that's totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. So use this week to work on that paper, and I expect it to be based in good academic research. And I expect you to make a historical argument and argue for it consistently through the paper in a way that's logical and clear and concise. So make sure you work on it this week. Don't leave it to the last second. If you work on a project like this little by little, little by little, day after day, you'll get it done. It'll be a lot better quality than if you leave it to the last second. And that's a lesson for writing your big capstones as well. If you work on it a little by little, and you get stuff down on paper, it's easier to revise it than it is to start from scratch. So work on your papers this week. I have a presentation this week. Obviously, every week I have my recorded presentations for you, and I'm glad to see a lot of people watching those presentations. I love to see people watching the presentations. It takes a lot of work to put those together, believe it or not, and I really get in. I really enjoy putting them together. I get into putting them together, but I like to see that people are watching them and learning and getting something out of them. So my presentation this week is on détente between the United States and the Soviet Union. So with that said, here's now for the factoid. I think that's all in terms of the information. The factoid for this week is this. So the Soviet Union by the 1970s was regarded as what historians might call a gerontocracy. It was an old leadership, that was really incapable of meaningful reform. By the end of the decade, by 1981, the average age of top leaders in the Soviet Union in Moscow was 71 years old. Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in his 50s, was considered sort of a youngster in the Soviet leadership. So the Soviet Union was in the 70s what you might call a gerontocracy. And this caused the Soviet Union to really suffer, whereas Nikita Khrushchev had really sought to take bold steps to sort of reform the Soviet Union, of course, with some significant backlash with events in Poland and Hungary and so forth. But Nikita Khrushchev had sought to really make some steps towards reforming the Soviet Union. And you'll see after the 70s, when Mikhail Gorbachev becomes Soviet leader, he will also take some bold steps at reform, steps that ultimately, as we'll see next week, result in the collapse of the Soviet Empire. But in the 1970s, there was really no reform-minded individuals present in the Soviet Union. The leadership was very old, and not only was the leadership very old, the leadership very much owed its existence to Stalin. Stalin had the leaders in the 70s were all individuals who had sort of escaped Stalin's purges. They had been around their mid-30s when Stalin was purging a lot of the top officials or the heads of the military and these types of things, which you've talked about. And as a result of this, the leadership that emerged in the 60s and 70s was the leadership that, when Stalin was doing those purges, was younger and sort of less experienced, and therefore escaped the purges. And so this leadership sort of owed its existence to Stalin. And as a result of that, some of those leaders, as they became older and more nostalgic, had a degree of reverence for the legacy of Stalin that was not possessed, for example, by like Nikita Khrushchev. And as a result of this made it even more difficult for them to reform a system that was really demonstrating some very huge problems at the time. And they continually tried things like, certain aspects of collectivized agriculture, despite the fact that those types of approaches had really shown themselves to pretty abundantly be failing. And so the factoid for this week is that the Soviet Union in the 1970s was regarded as a gerontocracy. They very much owed their existence to Joseph Stalin, the fact that they had escaped the purges. And in this lack of reform in the 1970s very much set the Soviet Union up for the reform efforts led by Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s. So the Soviet Union in the 1970s, a gerontocracy, really unable and incapable of meaningful reform. Have a great week. Email me if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the discussion forum this week, guys.